I'm Mrs. Miller, your teacher at ELA Academy. Welcome to part 2 of my series on short answer questions. If you missed part 1, be sure to watch it. Today, I'll demonstrate answering a question about characterization. Before we begin, let's review the basic elements of a short answer response. Answer the question, provide evidence from the text, and explain your answer. You might be surprised at how many students fail to answer the question. A common mistake is to simply summarize the text or use a quote and expect it to speak for itself. Here's the thing. If the evidence speaks for itself well enough that a separate answer doesn't seem necessary, then that answer is probably not deep enough. Your answer should involve an inference. It should go beneath the surface of the text. Now, there are any number of ways that you can put these puzzle pieces together in your response. The easiest one is 3 sentences. 1 sentence containing your answer, 1 sentence containing your evidence, and 1 sentence containing your explanation. The first video in this series has an example of a response with this pattern. But depending on the question, you may need to provide more evidence and explanations in order to write an effective response. As long as you have all 3 elements, it really doesn't matter what order they come in. Just make sure each sentence leads logically to the next. We're going to be working with the novel A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Even if you haven't read the novel, I'm sure you've all seen a movie or a cartoon version of it. Ebenezer Scrooge is rather unforgettable. Click this QR code to access a free PDF of the novel. Today's question is, how does Scrooge change as a result of his experience with the Christmas spirits? As I said earlier, this is a characterization question. What does the author reveal to us about Scrooge? Now, there is such a thing as a static character. Those don't change at all. Sometimes even the main character is static, but those usually don't make very interesting stories. What we really like to see is a dynamic character. They change somehow in the course of a story as a result of internal or external conflict. We see both kinds of conflict in this novel. External conflicts between Scrooge and his nephew, his clerk, the gentleman collecting for the poor, and of course the spirits. But we also see Scrooge struggling with his own conscience as he is faced with scenes from his past and the prospect of dying alone and unloved. So let's get started. The first step, of course, is to read and collect the evidence. It's okay, and sometimes it's necessary, to have an idea of what your answer will be, but you should keep an open mind. Collect any and all evidence that might help answer the question, and be open to a different answer that might make more sense and have better evidence than the first one you thought of. These are the notes that I took when I was keeping an open mind. Just looking for evidence of any way at all that Scrooge changed over time. Obviously, it's far too much material to fit into one paragraph, so what I decided after reviewing all of it was to focus on his attitude toward the poor. So let's look at the pieces of evidence I selected. Since the question asks how Scrooge changed, I have evidence of his attitude toward the poor before he met the spirits and after. Notice that these quotes are still too long to include in a short answer response, so I highlighted key parts of the evidence in red to help me narrow it down further. Now let's analyze the evidence. This means that we're making inferences and writing other thoughts that might become our explanation later on. Before he meets the spirits, when he's invited to donate money to the poor, he asks, "Aren't there still prisons and workhouses?" The gentleman replies that there are, but many would rather die than go there. Scrooge says, "Then they had better do it and decrease the surplus population." How terrible! He's so cold-hearted that he only sees the poor as numbers, not as people. They should just go ahead and die because they're a burden on the rest of us. No compassion whatsoever. Later, the Ghost of Christmas Present shows him his clerk Bob Cratchit and his family, including Tiny Tim. Tiny Tim is so sweet and loving and never complains about his handicap that Scrooge can't help feeling sorry for him. When he learns that Tiny Tim will die, he's upset. The ghost of Christmas Present throws his own words back at him and says that Tiny Tim should just get on with it and die so that we can reduce the surplus population. Scrooge is really ashamed to hear his heartless words applied to Tiny Tim. And at the end, Scrooge has changed. He was better than his word, and to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. He became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man as the good old city knew. Unlike many people who feel bad for a little while about something they did wrong and then sort of get over it and go back to doing more of the same, Scrooge's shame led him to make a permanent change. He treats not only the poor, but everyone else he meets as kindly and generously as he can. Now that we've analyzed the evidence, it's time to answer the question. I already had an idea at the beginning that Scrooge became a nicer person, but now I can be much more specific. How does Scrooge change as a result of his experience with the Christmas spirits? As a result of his experience with the Christmas spirits, Scrooge begins treating the poor with kindness instead of callous disregard. Notice that, just like in the first video, I'm including some of the words from the question in the answer. Also, since the question asks about a change, I've included both the before, callous disregard, and the after, kindness. Now we're going to put all of these thoughts together and make sure that we explain our answer and how the evidence supports it. Just like in the first video, the 3 answer elements will be color-coded: blue for answer, red for evidence, and green for explanation. Here we go. Answer in blue. As a result of his experience with the Christmas spirits, Scrooge begins treating other people with kindness instead of callous disregard. Evidence. For example, he refuses to donate money to the poor at Christmas because he thinks they should just go to the prisons or workhouses. When told that many would rather die than go to such places, he says that they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. Notice that part of my evidence is an exact quote and the rest is a summary. It's still just information from the text, not my own thoughts, but summarizing it helps to make it shorter. Now I'll explain the evidence. This is a cold-hearted attitude utterly lacking in compassion. He sees the poor only as numbers in a ledger, not as people with hopes and dreams whose only crime is poverty. Remember, these are still the same thoughts I wrote down when I was analyzing the evidence. I'm about to provide another piece of evidence, but I need a transition to show that we're going from the before to the after. So I've actually got some explanation before the quote it's explaining. After seeing his clerk's crippled son, Tiny Tim, however, he can now put a face to the poor. Evidence. The ghost of Christmas Present reveals that Tiny Tim will die and says he had better do it and decrease the surplus population. Explanation. Again, before the quote it's explaining. Hearing his words applied to the fragile but loving Tiny Tim, Scrooge is ashamed of his heartlessness. Now the evidence. He hung his head to hear his own words quoted by the Spirit and was overcome with penitence and grief. His shame leads him to make a genuine, lasting change, treating the poor and everyone else as kindly and generously as he can. He became a second father to Tiny Tim and as good a man as the good old city knew. Let's look at the pattern of answer elements for this response. We have an answer and 5 pieces of evidence mixed in with 4 explanations. Sometimes the explanation comes after the quote it goes with, and sometimes it goes before. There's no real rule about what order these elements go in. Again, just make sure each sentence logically leads to the next and that your reader can follow your train of reasoning. That's it for part 2 of Short Answer Basics. Keep an eye out for more videos on this and other topics. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Pinterest. And of course, you can find supplementary materials for each and every video at elaacademy.us. This is ELA Academy.